Hi guys, welcome back to G Chats with your host G. I'm so excited to bring to you today's episode because we are talking about urinary tract infections. This is a UTI 101. If you don't know, my journey into my business and into my educational content and studying the vaginal microbiome directly was a result of my own battle with urinary tract infections. I suffered with them my sophomore year. It started my sophomore year of college while I was studying biomedical engineering, and it allowed me to utilize my time at Lehigh to start researching the vaginal microbiome. And this is where I learned so much about my own anatomy and have now created with Meraki Co. and the educational content. And I really wanted to do this episode because I feel like a lot of you found me from TikTok, and that first video was me talking about my journey with my urinary tract infections. So I wanted to make this video about UTIs. I did one for BV, like a BV 101, and you guys loved it. So I figured let's do one for urinary tract infections. So without further ado, I don't want to waste too much time on the intro. Let's get into UTIs. So for starters, let's discuss what the urinary tract is. So the urinary tract, the three things you need to remember that the urinary tract is comprised of is the urethra, the bladder, and the kidneys. So a urinary tract infection is when a pathogen, and a pathogen is just a bad organism. And this bad organism, most cases, for most people who have urinary tract infections, is a bad kind of bacteria. But in some cases, it can be a bad fungus. But a pathogen, nonetheless, is what infects one of the three parts of your urinary tract. The most common of the three parts that gets infected is the bladder. So that is known as cystitis. So cystitis is the most common urinary tract infection. However, your urethra can be infected as well. That is urethritis. So although it's less common than a bladder infection, it can still get infected. And if a bladder infection or an infection of the urethra is left untreated, this can spread to your kidneys. The bacteria can spread to your kidneys, and this can cause a kidney infection. So it's really important that if you are having a urinary tract infection, and it likely will start in the bladder, it's very, very important that you get tested and treated immediately, because if it does spread to the kidneys, this causes much bigger health complications. So around 80 to 90% of urinary tract infections are caused by none other than E. coli. So most of you probably have heard of E. coli. There's been recalls on food and lettuce and things like that for E. coli. And E. coli is a very popular organism that exists in our gut. So we all have E. coli living in our stool and in our intestines. It's a very common organism, but they just are in very small amounts. This E. coli is responsible for urinary tract infections. However, there are other bacteria that can cause urinary tract infections like Klebsiella, Proteus, Enterococcus, and Pseudomonas. But a urinary tract infection honestly won't play too much games with you. You will likely know when you're having a UTI because of the burning sensation. There is frequency. You may feel like you need to pee a lot and keep running to the bathroom, but only small amounts come out. You might have blood, visible blood in your urine, dark colored urine, foul smelling urine. However, I don't like to base infections just solely off of symptoms because infections aren't a one size fits all. What I will say is that you likely will know when you're having a UTI, which is why once you have something that's off with the way that you're urinating, whether that is the pain or the smell or the frequency, whatever your symptom is, it's so important to make sure that you immediately go and get tested so you could get treated as soon as possible, because leaving a UTI untreated is very, very dangerous. And that is why so many elderly people, especially elderly people in nursing homes, a lot of times they have UTIs and don't even know that they're having a UTI because they're so old. And because of that, unfortunately, a UTI is responsible for killing some elderly people. So it's very dangerous because these UTI pathogens do spread to the kidneys when it's left untreated, and it could lead to sepsis, which could then kill you. So it's really important that upon any kind of symptoms that you're having that's like abnormal with your peeing, that you go get seen and checked out by a doctor. So as I mentioned, there's 3 parts of your urinary tract, which means there's 3 different urinary tract infections. There's the lower UTIs, which are bladder infections, also known as cystitis. It's the most common type of UTI, and the bacteria infects the bladder and it causes pain and urgency. Some symptoms that we see with people specifically with bladder infections is burning with urination. There's pelvic pressure, like right where your bladder is, and there's frequent urination. There's also an upper urinary tract infection, which is a kidney infection. And this is a more serious infection where the bacteria, as I mentioned, travels to the kidneys. And this has symptoms like fever. You may feel back pain in one or both sides of where your kidney is located, nausea and vomiting. And this requires prompt medical attention to prevent further complications. And then there's urethritis, which is an infection of the urethra. And this is caused by bacteria entering the urethra. And this usually happens through the vaginal opening and sometimes from sexual contact. It's really important to note that urethritis, an infection of the urethra, can be caused by things like STIs. So STIs can infect the urethral opening and the urethra like tube, but it is different than like what we see in a traditional urinary tract infection, because that would be ruled as a sexually transmitted infection that has infected the urethra and not necessarily a urinary tract infection. Yes, the urinary tract is infected, but it was infected by a sexually transmitted infection or bacteria. So it's slightly different because your vagina is likely colonized now by this bacteria as well. So the symptoms of urethritis is a burning sensation, sometimes discharge, because as I mentioned, a lot of the cases of urethritis are caused by sexually transmitted infections, and there's discomfort during urination. So it's really important to just remember that urethritis isn't super common with just pathogens like E. coli or Kleb, because your bladder is constantly flushing and your kidneys are working to flush out toxins. And so usually if there is, I like to think of urinary tract infections as the itsy bitsy spider climbed up the water spout. So imagine that the water spout is the urethra. Well, the bladder and the kidneys are constantly flushing away this itsy bitsy spider that's trying to climb up the water spout. So usually, even if your urethra is in contact with E. coli, it doesn't typically cause a full-blown infection, and that is because your bladder and your kidneys are functioning properly to constantly flush out toxins. Usually urethritis happens when it's in contact with something like a sexually transmitted infection like chlamydia or gonorrhea. These pathogens can infect the urethra along with the vaginal opening. So how do UTIs happen? So traditionally, it has been thought that UTIs occur due to bacteria traveling from the butthole to the vagina, which is why women are more prone to UTIs than men. And that is largely due to the fact that our buttholes and our vaginas are very close to each other, and they're 2 openings that are just right there close to each other. And our urethra, a woman's urethra, is much shorter than a man's urethra. So when we talk about that itsy bitsy spider complex, the itsy bitsy spider can climb up the water spout a lot quicker in a woman's urethra than a man's urethra, because a man's urethra is much longer than ours. So the itsy bitsy spider can make its way to the bladder much quicker. So that's kind of been the thought, where the bacteria comes from the butthole, because as I mentioned, we know that E. coli, Kleb, Pseudomonas, all of these pathogens come from our poop. They come from our gut. We know that much. So the bacteria comes from the poop, and it comes from the rectal mucosa, which ascends to the vaginal mucosa, invades the vaginal opening, invades the urethral opening, climbs up the water spout, invades the bladder, and causes an infection. So this direct contamination route is valid. It is a valid point, and we've seen it in literature and research. We know that it's a valid point. However, it is not the full picture, especially in people with recurring urinary tract infections. So I really wanted to bring this episode to you today to really discuss the gut and urinary axis because it's a much deeper mechanism that's not talked about enough, because newer research is suggesting that UTI-causing bacteria doesn't necessarily just hop from the anus to the vagina. Instead, uropathogenic bacteria like E. coli originates from an overgrown, imbalanced gut microbiome, and it takes multiple hidden pathways to infect the bladder. So we've always seen the advice of make sure you're wiping front to back, make sure that you're doing this and doing that, peeing after sex, and all of the external like cleaning and hygiene. But hygiene isn't the full story, and we know for certain in research that the bad bacteria that causes UTIs is 100% without a doubt coming from the bad bacteria that's in the gut, and it's overgrown, and there's dysbiosis, there's imbalance in the gut causing this E. coli to flourish, and that's what's causing a urinary tract infection. So everyone has E. coli in their gut, but not all E. coli causes urinary tract infections. Some strains are uropathogenic, which is called UPEC E. coli, and that's what we refer to in literature as the bacteria that causes UTIs. And these bacteria have special traits that allow them to survive in the urine. It invades the blood cells and it forms biofilms. A disrupted gut microbiome, also known as dysbiosis, caused by antibiotics, diet, stress, or inflammation, allows these UTI-causing strains to overgrow. And the gut acts as a reservoir. So it constantly seeds the urinary tract with new infections because now this bad bacteria is thriving in the gut. So there's a number of different ways that it seeds into the urinary tract, and these are referred to as translocation pathways. So the first way that these bad guys that we know are in the gut, how they get to the urinary tract, is through hematogenous spread, which is the bloodstream route. So when the gut lining is inflamed, also known as a leaky gut, so there's tons of people who have a leaky gut, uropathogenic bacteria can enter the bloodstream. And these bacteria then seed the kidneys and or the bladder via the blood. So they use the blood to get to the kidney and the bladders rather than traveling from your butthole to your vagina. An example of this is Enterococcus is a common urinary tract infection pathogen that is also found in bloodstream infections. So research has identified that those of you with urinary tract infections due to Enterococcus have had signs of Enterococcus in your bloodstream as well, highlighting this bloodstream pathway. Another pathway is lymphatic spread. So the lymphatic system drains toxins and bacteria from the gut. If there's gut inflammation, then pathogenic bacteria can spread through lymphatic channels to nearby organs, and that includes the bladder. This is less direct, but it is clinically suspected of a route of bladder colonization. There's also direct migration via the enterourinary pathway, and this is very interesting because some intestinal bacteria like uropathogenic E. coli can migrate directly from the intestines to the bladder by moving through the gut wall and into the urinary tract. And this might explain why some people with recurring urinary tract infections test positive for the exact same urinary tract infection strain for months or even years, because the bacteria is persistent in their gut and it keeps reseeding into the bladder through basically transferring through the gut wall and into the urinary tract. So that is another pathway that we are seeing in research studies. And of course, the fourth way that this is possibly happening is through biofilms in the bladder. So unfortunately, once the bladder is infected by E. coli, it can invade the bladder lining and form intracellular biofilms, which is a sticky, slimy coating that basically protects the bad guys from any antibiotic treatment. And antibiotics temporarily suppress symptoms because it will attack the free-floating bacteria bacteria in the bladder, but what it doesn't address is the bacteria that's embedded in this biofilm. So because of this, it leads to recurring urinary tract infections because the bacteria is embedded in your bladder lining, and as it's growing, you have the free floating bacteria and you're having this constant irritation that you're feeling from your bladder wall being inflamed, but the antibiotics aren't actually getting to them because of biofilms. So as I mentioned, this explains why recurring urinary tract infections are so present even with 10 out of 10 good hygiene. If UTIs were only caused from the anus to the urethra route, like from the perineum space, and that was the only way that urinary tract infections happen, well, then better hygiene would eliminate recurrent urinary tract infections altogether. But many people, especially those with recurring urinary tract infections, they still get them despite great hygiene practices. And what we do see is that women with gut dysbiosis like SIBO, IBS, or even antibiotic overuse are at a higher risk of recurring urinary tract infections. And E. coli doesn't always need direct contact. We talked about the travel routes, and that's the bloodstream, the lymphatic system, or directly through the intestinal wall, the intestinal permeability. And even if you kill bladder bacteria with antibiotics, the gut will still remain as a reservoir, and that's why UTIs keep coming back. So you could take all the supplements in the world to flush out your urinary tract, cleanse your urinary tract, but where is that bacteria coming from? Science is literally telling us it's coming from the gut. You have to heal the gut. You have to fix the gut. If you don't heal or fix the gut, then you're not really fixing or resolving the problem. And there is clinical evidence and studies that support that the gut is the main issue. So studies show that 90% of recurrent urinary tract infection patients also have gut dysbiosis, which is when they have reduced diversity, they have an overgrowth of bad bacteria, and they have low counts of good bacteria like lactobacillus, for example. Clinical evidence has also shown that FMT, which is fecal microbiota transplants, which is essentially they will take somebody who's very healthy, who has very healthy gut microbiomes. So they have a lot of diversity, lots of different strains. They have more good bacteria than bad bacteria, and they have little counts of bad bacteria. They will take this person's microbiome, their fecal, their stool, and they will transplant it into a patient who has gut dysbiosis, who actually has bad bacteria. They don't have any good bacteria. They have an imbalance in their gut microbiome. When this happened, it restored the healthy gut bacteria, and it has successfully eliminated recurrent urinary tract infections in these patients. So this yet again highlights if you correct your gut microbiome, you solve the issue of urinary tract infections. Another thing is, of course, the obvious probiotic therapy. It has restored the gut and vaginal microbiome, which reduces recurrent urinary tract infections more effectively than antibiotics alone, because antibiotics just kill the bad bacteria and it does kill the good bacteria as well. So it reduces the diversity. When you take oral antibiotics for urinary tract infections, you are directly harming your gut microbiome. You're killing off all of the diversity, all of the good bacteria. And so you're leaving your gut microbiome at this empty slate of, oh, I can get more bad guys to flourish in here because you have no good guys to protect you. So you have to restore the gut microbiome along with the vaginal microbiome to protect you. And we also see in clinical studies that leaky gut and systemic inflammation have been linked to higher rates of urinary tract infections due to the migration of the bacteria from the gut. So ultimately, this is highlighting just how important it is to correct the gut microbiome if you are someone who is struggling with urinary tract infections. And this is also a really good time to highlight the fact that multiple urinary tract infections, just having UTI after UTI after UTI, and then also that being a sign of gut dysbiosis, can contribute to pelvic floor dysfunction, PFD, and impaired bladder function. So you can unfortunately ruin the way that your pelvic floor muscles are supposed to be working and the way your bladder is supposed to be working. And this creates a vicious cycle that makes individuals even more susceptible to future UTIs. So let's talk about it. So repeated urinary tract infections lead to chronic inflammation in the bladder. And this inflammation that exists in the bladder causes the pelvic floor muscles to tighten around the bladder because your pelvic floor muscles sense that something's wrong. There's inflammation. So your pelvic floor muscles are just trying to protect you, so they tighten. And over time, what happens is when your pelvic floor is chronically tight for a long period of time because of inflammation and all of the urinary tract infections and the added stress to the bladder, unfortunately, this can cause a hypertonic pelvic floor, which leads to pelvic floor dysfunction because it can make urination incomplete, or it increases urinary retention, which allows bacteria to thrive. So you're basically not emptying your bladder out fully because in order to pee, your pelvic floor muscles need to relax. They have to relax so that you can empty out the bladder properly. If your muscles around your bladder are just tightening, you're going to be twinging while you're peeing. You're not going to be able to let the pee out fully. And if you are holding in and retaining your urine, unfortunately, this can lead to bacteria that's in the bladder because your urine is not sterile. There's always pathogens in your bladder and in your urine, but you have to continuously flush it out. If you're not emptying your bladder properly, or your body doesn't know how to use its bladder properly because of all the UTIs, and now you have a hypertonic pelvic floor, you are at an increased risk of having bacteria thrive within your bladder and causing a urinary tract infection. And it's also important to note that over time, chronic pelvic tension reduces blood flow to the bladder, so that also impairs its ability to fight infections. There's also bladder nerve dysfunction and impaired emptying, as I talked about. So chronic infections irritate the pudendal and pelvic nerves, which control bladder function. And this nerve irritation can lead to urinary hesitancy, incomplete emptying, and increased residual urine, creating the most perfect environment for bad bacteria to grow and flourish. And a dysfunctional bladder also increases urgency, frequency, and pain, symptoms that may mimic a UTI, but you might not even have a UTI present because the nerve endings are damaged. So that's something that even I suffered with after I had all of my UTIs. I remember there was a period of time where I was having symptoms of a UTI, but all of my cultures and testing that I was doing were coming back negative for urinary tract infections. And I knew, I'm like, this feels like a UTI, but it's not a UTI because I know that I would be peeing blood. I know exactly what a UTI feels like at this point. It's like a UTI, but different, but it's mimicking a UTI. And it was my nerve endings that were damaged from all the UTIs that I had that was giving me UTI symptom without an actual UTI. So that's something that a lot of women unfortunately suffer with. And this creates the cycle of susceptibility because dysbiosis in the gut and in the vagina fuels recurrent urinary tract infections. And urinary tract infections cause pelvic floor dysfunction. And pelvic floor dysfunction prevents a full bladder to empty, and residual urine, the urine that's left in the bladder that's not being emptied, breeds more infections, and now you have this vicious cycle of dysbiosis, recurring urinary tract infections. But it's just a vicious cycle. So that's why addressing gut health in combination with pelvic floor function, bladder integrity together, all three of them, is the key to stopping recurrent urinary tract infections for good. So ultimately, this means that for UTI prevention, beyond hygiene, you have to correct the gut microbiome. So understanding the gut and urinary axis highlights that recurrent urinary tract infections are rarely just about hygiene or external contamination. Instead, they're a clear indicator of gut dysbiosis and an imbalance or an overgrowth of harmful bacteria like E. coli in the gut microbiome. Your gut is a persistent reservoir for these pathogens, and as long as it remains abundant in your gut, they will continuously seed your urinary tract and cause repeated infections. So it doesn't matter. I've been asked before, a lot of people ask me like, oh, why didn't you create a probiotic gel or a probiotic suppository that you can insert in the vagina? The reason why I went with an oral supplement is because I understood how important the gut microbiome is. So even if you are doing proper hygiene practices, and even if you were using a probiotic suppository for your vagina, if you are not fixing where the bad bacteria is coming from, and I'm telling you, and research is telling us that bad bacteria is coming from the gut. So you have to fix that in combination with rebalancing the vaginal microbiome, and that's what's going to set you up for success. You can balance the vagina and have proper hygiene practices as much as you want. But if you don't fix the gut, the bacteria is just going to keep seeding, which is why so many people feel like they're going crazy when they literally take every single supplement on the market for their vagina, and they shove up everything up their vagina, boric acid and all these things. They take their vinegar baths. They're using, I saw like now there's hypochlorous acid spray for your vagina and your perineum space. Like these people, every antibiotic or antibacterial soap, like people are using everything like antiseptic for external contamination and basically like douching out their vaginas or even putting in probiotics in their vagina, but they're never correcting their gut microbiome. So it doesn't matter because the bad bacteria is still there. It's in your gut. You have to correct your gut microbiome. And this dysbiosis that's in your gut is in fact a leaky gut and systemic inflammation. And I don't think that people realize that 70% of your immune system starts with your gut. So a damaged gut lining, intestinal permeability allows pathogens to translocate through the bloodstream or the lymphatics into the bladder and bypasses hygiene measures altogether. So when you have dysbiosis, you have a leaky gut, you have systemic inflammation. And this is what allows for those 4 pathways that we discussed. That's what allows it to happen. So antibiotics alone won't solve the problem because antibiotics kill the bacteria in your bladder temporarily, but they'll worsen the gut dysbiosis by killing beneficial bacteria, leaving you even more susceptible to future infections. So instead of focusing on things like wiping front to back, peeing after sex, and avoiding tight clothes, wearing cotton underwear, like all of those are great practices, but if you are suffering with recurring urinary tract infections, the key here is healing the gut microbiome, reducing gut permeability and inflammation, addressing biofilms that may be in the bladder, and avoiding antibiotic overuse. That is the key. It always has been the key, but it just hasn't been discussed or told to patients like it should be. So healing your gut is the key if you are someone who is struggling with urinary tract infections. And I'm super, super excited to say that I may or may not have a product that I'm launching within, I want to say maybe the next month or two, that is meant for those of you dealing with this problem. It is meant to heal your gut. If you are not healing your gut, you are not healing your urinary tract infections. So that is the most important takeaway from this episode. I know it is. Yeah, this is a rather short episode, but I feel like this gives you all of the concise and important information that you need to understand urinary tract infections better. So I really hope that you guys enjoyed it. And I wanted to do this new thing. Let me grab this quick. So I have these. I had bought these from Marshall's, and it's called Finding Joy in Her Everyday Life. And I wanted to do this thing where at the end of every episode, I pick a card from one of these 4 categories, and I basically answer the questions that are on them on camera or on recording. And this is just so that we can bond a little more. You guys can get to know me and just share a little bit of me with you guys. So there is self-care, gratitude, goals, and focus. So I'm just gonna, I don't know how I'm gonna do this. Let's see. Let's do goals for today since it's the first. Let's do that. Okay, so the front of this card says, bring on those new possibilities. I love that. So what is your goal is this question. And this funny because my goal is to launch the gut healing product that I am hinting at. I'm so excited. This isn't like what you guys are probably expecting. So I'm super, super excited. Action steps are me testing out the samples that I have right now, creating a design for it, creating a name for it, finalizing the timeline for everything and the marketing timeline for everything. And this asks, what is the deadline? I think this was such a perfect card for me to pick up for this episode. But the deadline, honestly, let's set the deadline for April. Let's do that. I want to pick a deadline of April 27th. I don't know why I chose that. It's right before my birthday. My birthday's May 1st. But April 27th is the deadline for me. I better have that product launch before then. So it's in the design phase. I have the product. I'm using it because I always use my products. I'm my own customer. So I use my own products. So I'm in the works of using it, testing it out, and designing the label and stuff like that. So yeah, that was the question on this card. What is my goal, action steps, and a deadline? So I wanted to do that. I think this is cute, and I think I will do it at the end of pretty much every episode just to bond with you guys a little more. But yeah, nonetheless, that is it for today's episode. I love you guys so much. Please don't forget to share this with somebody who's having urinary tract infections. Like, comment, subscribe, rate, do all of the things. And don't forget to check out my website and shop our products. But if you guys want short form content and want to see other content, don't forget to follow me on TikTok. I'm sure most of you already are. But anyways, I love you guys so much. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you in next week's episode. Bye, guys. Mwah.